I will never forget that Christmas dinner. My dad raised his glass, smiled at the guests, and then turned on me. He called me a disgrace just like my late mother, and said I was not even half the woman my stepmother was. Elaine smirked. Victoria looked proud and the room froze. For years I stayed silent at that table, but not this time. I pushed back my chair and told him the truth he had buried, the truth that left him choking while every guest stared. That was the night everything changed. The night secrets buried for decades began to rise, and the night I chose to stop being silent. The dining room of the Monroe Hotel glowed with the kind of holiday perfection that most people only see in glossy magazines. Crystal chandeliers reflected the gold and red garlands that draped across the walls. A 12-foot Christmas tree rose in the corner, its ornaments catching the light like jewels. The scent of roasted turkey cinnamon and expensive wine drifted through the air, mixing with the faint smell of polished mahogany. Guests filled the long banquet table, laughing too loudly, their forks clinking against china plates. It was Christmas night, yet it felt more like a stage set for a performance. I sat at the far end, hands folded in my lap, watching the swirl of tailored suits and sequined dresses. My dad, Charles Monroe, sat at the head of the table, his posture as rigid as ever, his silver hair catching the chandelier's glow. At 62, he was still the king of this empire, or at least he carried himself as though he was. Beside him sat Elaine, his 45-year-old wife, my stepmother, in a shimmering emerald dress that looked like it had been chosen to outshine the tree itself. She smiled at everyone with the confidence of a woman who knew she owned the room. On her left, my half-sister Victoria, 34, sat with perfect poise, her diamond earrings glittering when she tilted her head to laugh at some joke. I felt out of place, as I always did at these dinners. My black dress was simple, the same one I had worn at countless events, because unlike the rest of them, I did not need to prove wealth through sequins or jewels. The voices around me rose and fell in practiced rhythm. I could hear the rhythm of the jazz band playing softly in the background, the piano keys blending with the hum of conversation. The waiters moved like shadows, placing plates of roasted duck and bowls of potatoes, topping off wine glasses before they were empty. I kept my eyes down, pretending to focus on the cranberry sauce, but my stomach was tight. Every year I came back hoping things would be different, but every year it was the same. I was tolerated, not welcomed. My dad tapped his fork against his glass and the chatter died away. His voice carried easily, strong and commanding, the voice of a man who had built Monroe hotels from nothing into a chain, recognized across Boston and beyond. He started with the usual words about gratitude, about family, about the blessings of the season. I stared at the flickering candles, trying to let his voice wash over me. For a moment, I thought maybe he would get through the evening without aiming his sharp edge at me. Then he paused, his gaze sweeping the table. I knew that look. My heart picked up. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that cut. Some families, he said, know the meaning of loyalty. They understand duty and legacy. Then there are others who forget where they come from, who chase childish dreams, who waste what they have been given. A murmur of agreement rose around the table. I felt heat climb into my cheeks. My fork trembled slightly against the porcelain plate. I told myself not to react. I had heard his speeches 100 times before. But then his eyes locked on me. My daughter Rachel. He let the words hang heavy with disdain. At 31 years old, you are still chasing microphones and internet nonsense. You are a disgrace, just like your mother. The words landed like a slap. Around me, forks froze in midair. I heard someone gasp softly. Elaine's lips curled into a satisfied smirk, as though she had been waiting all evening for this moment. Victoria leaned back, folding her arms across her chest, her expression smug, proud of the cut that had nothing to do with her, but everything to feed her, need to feel superior. I stared at my dad, the pulse in my ears loud, drowning out the soft music. I wanted to shrink back, to disappear, but something inside me steadied. The years of biting my tongue, of carrying my shame, quietly pressed forward. I heard my mother's voice in memory, telling me once when I was a child to never let anyone define me. Not even half the woman your stepmother is, my dad added, his voice sharp. Look at Elaine. She has grace, loyalty, elegance. She is everything your mother was not, everything you will never be. The room fell silent. I could hear the faint tick of the antique clock on the wall. Elaine lifted her glass of wine, tilting it toward me, her smirk widening. My half-sister's eyes gleamed, like she was savoring the humiliation unfolding at the table. I pushed back my chair, the sound of wood scraping against marble cutting through the silence. Every head turned, my heart beat fast, but my voice came steady. Then stop borrowing my money to pay for her perfect life. The words dropped into the room like a stone thrown into still water. The effect was immediate. My dad's face went pale, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. Elaine's smile froze her glass, hovering halfway to her lips. Victoria's proud expression cracked, her eyes darting between my dad and me in confusion. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Some leaned forward, eager for more. Others glanced away, pretending not to notice their discomfort palpable. The waiters froze near the doorway, unsure whether to retreat or keep serving. I stood tall, every muscle trembling, but I would not let them see me break. I gathered my clutch from the table, straightened my shoulders, and turned toward the grand double doors at the far end of the room. My heels clicked sharply against the marble floor with each step. The weight of 100 eyes pressed against my back. Behind me, I could hear my dad choke on his breath, trying to recover, trying to salvage dignity. He began speaking again, fumbling through his toast, but his voice faltered. Elaine whispered something sharp under her breath, her smirk gone. Victoria muttered, but I did not turn to listen. I reached the doors and pushed them open. The heavy wood gave way, and the sound of laughter and music from the hotel lobby spilled in, clashing with the silence behind me. I stepped through, letting the doors close slowly at my back. The cool air of the lobby touched my skin, a relief after the stifling tension of the dining room. My breath came fast, my chest tight, but I felt light, almost free. For the first time in years, I had spoken the truth. I kept walking past the glittering Christmas decorations, past the wide-eyed hotel guests who looked at me curiously, past the doorman who tipped his hat in confusion. Outside, the Boston night air bit at my cheeks, sharp and cold. I pulled my coat tighter, staring up at the dark sky. The city lights glowed against the falling snow. I thought of my mother then, Elizabeth. With her soft laugh and the way she used to hum while folding laundry, I wondered if she would have been proud of me for standing tall, or if she would have told me to keep peace. I could never know. But what I did know was that I would not be silent anymore. The cold air filled my lungs. My hands still trembled, but there was a fire inside me now, one that no insult could put out. Behind those doors, my dad would spin his story. Elaine would soothe his ego. Victoria would cling to her illusion of superiority. But they all knew now. They knew who had been keeping their perfect life afloat. I stepped onto the snowy sidewalk, the sound of car tires hissing against slush echoing in the night. My heels sank slightly into the wet pavement, but I kept walking. Every step felt like a small victory, a shedding of weight I had carried for far too long. I did not know what tomorrow would bring. I did not know how the gossip would spread or what consequences would follow, but in that moment I had no regrets. I had given them the truth they deserved, and I had walked away. When I left the Monroe Hotel that night, the cold air burned my lungs and the sting of my dad's words clung to me like the frost settling on my coat. I walked for blocks through the Boston streets, past blinking holiday lights and store windows dressed in tinsel, but no matter how far I went, I could still hear him in my head. Disgrace just like your mother. I had thought I was numb to it by now, that years of cutting remarks had hardened me, but the mention of her name reopened something raw. It was not just an insult to me. It was a wound ripped open for a woman who was no longer here to defend herself. Elizabeth Carter, my mother. She had been gone since I was 10. Some nights her face came to me in dreams, faint and warm, but most of the time it was her absence I felt. The empty chair at recitals, the phone calls that never came, the smell of her perfume that faded from the curtains until one day it was just gone. My dad never spoke kindly of her after she died. He carried on as though she had been nothing but a mistake in his perfect empire. I remember one night when I was 12, the house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I had found an old shoebox in the attic filled with her things. Photographs of her laughing in a sundress, a letter she had written in looping script, a brooch shaped like a bird. I carried it down to the kitchen where my dad was drinking coffee and reading hotel reports. I asked him about her, about the day they met, about the way she used to smile. He barely looked up. He told me to put it back, that she was not worth remembering, that I should focus on the future. He never said her name. That night I put the box back in the attic, but I kept the brooch under my pillow. Growing up with that silence made me hungry for stories about her. I would sit with my Aunt Maggie whenever she visited and ask for details. Maggie would smile sadly, brushing flour off her hands from whatever cookies she was baking, and she would tell me how my mother had loved music, how she would dance barefoot in the kitchen, how she had wanted to paint the living room yellow, but my dad insisted on beige. Maggie said my mother had a laugh that filled a room. I clung to those fragments because they were all I had. When my dad married Elaine, the narrative hardened. Elaine was graceful, elegant, polished. She spoke French, she knew which fork to use. She could host a dinner party with the ease of a professional. She was everything my dad praised, and everything he said my mother was not. He would hold Elaine's hand in public, a gesture I had never seen him give my mother, and he would boast about her refinement. At the table, he would glance at me and say that Elaine was the kind of woman who knew loyalty, who knew how to stand by her husband, unlike some others. As a teenager, I began to realize what he was doing. He was rewriting the story of my family so that Elizabeth was the shame and Elaine was the savior. And me, I was cast as Elizabeth's continuation, the daughter destined to fail. Every time I tried to show interest in something creative, whether it was writing music or later audio, he would shake his head and mutter that I was just like her. One winter when I was 16, we had a fight in the driveway. Snow fell heavy that evening, coating the car hoods in white. I had been accepted into an after-school program for radio production. I was thrilled, certain he would see it as an accomplishment. Instead, he dismissed it as a waste of time. He shouted at me in the cold, his breath clouding in the air, saying I was choosing weakness, that my mother had chosen weakness too. And look where that had left her. His words carved into me that night. I ran back into the house, my boots leaving wet prints on the marble floor, and slammed the door to my room. I buried my face in my pillow and told myself I would never forgive him. The years after my mother's death were filled with moments like that, small cuts that left lasting scars. At family events, Elaine would wear pearls and smile with practiced sweetness, and when my dad praised her, I felt myself disappearing. Victoria, older and favored, learned early to echo his judgments. She would roll her eyes when I spoke, toss her hair, call me dreamy or useless. It was not just their voices I battled, it was the weight of silence too. My mother's story was erased, her photograph removed from the hallway, her belongings tucked away. All that remained was the shadow of her name on my dad's tongue when he wanted to wound me, but the thing is, memory is stubborn. It creeps back through cracks no matter how hard you try to seal them. I remember the day of my 10th birthday party a month before she died. She had set up balloons in the backyard, pink and white, and baked a cake herself even though she burned the first one. She laughed and said it did not matter, she would make another. That laugh stayed with me. It was warm and unguarded. It is the laugh I hear in my own voice sometimes when I forget to be careful. After the dinner at the hotel, when my dad compared me to her again, I could not shake those old memories. I lay awake that night in my apartment, the city noise humming outside, and I thought of how unfair it was that she was used as a weapon when she could not defend herself. She had been human, flawed maybe, but human, and she had loved me. She deserved to be remembered with kindness, not scorn. I pulled the brooch from my nightstand drawer where I still kept it, the one shaped like a bird. I turned it over in my hand, tracing the little crack on its wing. It reminded me that my mother had existed outside of my dad's narrative, that she had been her own person with dreams and laughter. There was a night when I was 20, and Aunt Maggie sat with me on her porch in Cambridge. The summer air was thick with the smell of roses. I confessed how much it hurt when my dad called me a disgrace like my mother. Maggie looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Your mother was never a disgrace. She was strong, she was kind, she just did not fit into his world. Do not ever confuse his story with the truth." That sentence replayed in my mind after the Christmas dinner. I began to wonder what else had been hidden from me. Why had my mother's memory been so thoroughly erased? What else had been taken away when her name was used only to shame? I remembered overhearing a conversation when I was younger, muffled through a half-closed door. My dad had been arguing with someone on the phone about documents and signatures. He said her name once, Elizabeth, and then lowered his voice. At the time, I was too young to understand, but the memory had stayed with me. Now, as I pieced together the pattern, I wondered if there had been more than grief and disdain. Maybe there had been something he wanted to bury, something that connected to me. Lying in bed after the hotel dinner, I felt a strange mix of anger and resolve. I realized that his words meant to break me had given me a reason to look closer. My mother was not just a shadow used to humiliate me. She was the beginning of a story I had never been allowed to know fully. I wanted to learn the truth. I closed my eyes and let the memories wash over me. The hum of her song while she folded laundry, the way she tucked my hair behind my ears before school, the smell of her perfume when she hugged me. These were mine, not his. They were not disgrace, they were love. Snow fell quietly outside my window, covering the city in white. For the first time in years, I felt a pull toward her, not as a ghost but as a guide. I whispered her name into the darkness, letting it linger in the air, and promised her I would not let his words be the final story. The weeks that followed that Christmas night were a blur of restless thoughts and old memories that refused to stay buried. I went about my days at the studio, editing episodes and holding meetings with Sophie and Daniel, but each time I closed my eyes, I could still see my dad at the head of that long, polished table, the weight of his gaze heavy as he called me my mother's disgrace. I carried those words like a bruise. They throbbed quietly underneath everything I did. When I was younger, I used to believe that if I worked hard enough and kept quiet enough, I could slip through family gatherings unnoticed. But as I sat in my apartment after that dinner, I realized it had never worked. Silence had not protected me. All those years of folding my napkin on my lap, biting my tongue until it ached, forcing myself to swallow whatever pride I had left, none of it stopped my dad from finding a way to humiliate me in front of everyone. The truth was, it had been happening for years. Each holiday dinner carried the same rhythm. The waiters moving in synchronized steps, the clink of glasses, the smell of red meat and wine, and then the conversation would turn like a storm cloud drifting across the table. He would ask me about my plans, and before I could answer, he would remind me of my obligations, legacy, duty, responsibility, words that tasted bitter on his tongue, but sweet when he spoke of Victoria. One night when I was 24 stands out clearer than the others. It was the spring after I had graduated from NYU with a degree in media studies. The hotel dining room smelled of garlic and rosemary from the roasted lamb the chef had prepared. My dad leaned across the table, his knife glinting under the lights, and told me that working in audio was nothing but a phase. He said I was wasting my potential, that I was turning my back on the Monroe name. Victoria smirked, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she lifted her wine glass. Elaine patted his hand as if to calm him, though her eyes sparkled with triumph. That night, I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to tell him about the internship I had landed at a small radio station, about how it made me feel alive in a way the sterile hallways of Monroe hotels never had, but the words dried up in my throat. I nodded, staring down at the silverware, and said nothing. I remember excusing myself early, retreating to the ladies' room, pressing cold water against my cheeks to keep from crying. The pattern continued year after year. At birthdays, at Easter brunches, at every contrived event where family and investors gathered, the script remained the same. He would boast about Victoria's promotions and then pivot to me, asking when I planned to contribute in a real way. Sometimes he would phrase it as a joke, sometimes as a warning, but always with the same purpose. To remind everyone at the table that I was the disappointment. I told myself I could endure it. I told myself that if I kept my head down and proved my worth outside of his world, eventually he would see me differently. But the truth is, endurance wears thin. By the time I was 28, I was exhausted. I remember one autumn evening when the leaves had turned red along the Charles River. We were gathered at a private dining room downtown, the windows overlooking the city lights. Victoria had just secured a new contract with an international resort partner, and my dad was beaming with pride. He ordered champagne for everyone and announced to the room that this was what success looked like. Then he turned to me, his smile fading, and asked what I had brought to the table. I opened my mouth to mention the growing audience for my podcast, how I had recently interviewed a local activist whose story had reached thousands, but he cut me off. He said podcasts were not real work, that I was embarrassing myself by chasing noise while others built tangible things. The words sank heavy into the silence that followed. Guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing between us. I felt my chest tighten. My Aunt Maggie squeezed my hand under the table, a quiet reminder that I was not alone, but the damage was done. I excused myself again, retreating to the restroom, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I saw my mother's eyes in mine, tired and defiant, and I wondered how many times she had stood in that same place feeling the same despair. It was not only insults. There were other moments, quieter but no less sharp. Times when my dad would lean close, his voice calm, and remind me that family came first. That if I wanted stability, I needed to stop playing with microphones and step into the business. One evening he suggested I join the marketing team. He said it would give me a steady salary and a place in the company. I clenched my fork and told him I was doing fine. Victoria snorted and muttered that hobbies would never pay the bills. I swallowed my anger and kept my voice even, but inside I felt the sting of their dismissal. And then came the requests for money. At first they were subtle. A casual mention of cash flow issues, a reminder that the hotel industry could be unpredictable. He would phrase it as an opportunity, a way for me to invest in my own future. I wanted peace at those dinners, so I agreed. I wrote checks quietly, hoping it would buy me a reprieve. For a time it did. He would thank me with a pat on the shoulder, as though I were a child who had finally behaved. But the pattern grew. Each dinner seemed to end with another request. One night in particular stays with me. The dining room was filled with the smell of roasted duck, the lights dimmed low. My dad leaned in, his voice steady, and said there was a pressing need for funds to cover a delay in an expansion project. Victoria's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, knowing that once again I would bend. I looked at the plate in front of me, my appetite gone, and nodded. Later that week, I transferred the money. No one outside the family knew. To the world, we were the perfect Monroes, untouched by trouble. Only I knew the truth. The weight of those dinners grew unbearable. Each time I gave in, a little piece of me eroded. I told myself it was easier to hand over the money than to endure another round of humiliation, but in the quiet of my apartment I hated myself for it. I felt complicit in their charade, keeping them afloat while they mocked me. I tried once to refuse. It was a summer night, the scent of grilled steak filling the dining room. My dad spoke of legacy and then casually mentioned another shortfall. He turned to me expectant. I shook my head. For a moment, silence stretched across the table. Elaine's smile faltered. Victoria's brow furrowed. My dad's eyes hardened. He said if I wanted to be cut off completely, he could arrange that. He said loyalty meant sacrifice, and clearly I had none. The pressure was unbearable. I caved within a week, sending the funds ashamed of my weakness. Looking back now, I realize those dinners were battlegrounds disguised as celebrations. The polished silver and crystal glasses were armor. The words exchanged were weapons. I was never meant to win. I was meant to surrender, to give up pieces of myself until nothing remained. But I was changing. Slowly, beneath the surface, something inside me was hardening. Each insult, each demand, each check I wrote planted a seed of resistance. I began to keep copies of the transfers documenting the amounts. I told myself it was for my records, but deep down I knew I was preparing for something more. After the Christmas dinner, when I finally spoke the truth aloud, all those years of silence came rushing back. I remembered every time I had let him take my voice, every time I had handed over money to keep the peace, and I knew I would never do it again. The image of my dad choking on his breath after I exposed him in front of his guests was burned into me. It was a reminder that power can shift in an instant. He had controlled the story for decades, but now I had proof that the story was not his alone. It was mine too. I sat alone in my apartment after that night, the city lights blinking through the window, and thought about the pattern of those dinners. They had shaped me, yes, but they had also revealed the cracks in his empire. He needed me more than he ever admitted. That realization gave me a strange comfort. For years I had believed I was the weak one, the outsider, the disgrace. Now I saw the truth. Without me, his perfect image might have already collapsed. The thought settled in my chest like a steady flame. I knew the battles ahead would not be easy. My dad would not surrender control willingly. Victoria and Elaine would tighten their grip, desperate to maintain their place. But the balance had shifted. I had stopped being the silent daughter at the end of the table. I closed my eyes that night and let the memories fade. The sound of cutlery clinking, the weight of his voice, the sting of humiliation. They would not haunt me forever. I had endured them, and now I was free to fight on my own terms. I still remember the first day Echo Wave Media felt real. It was late summer of 2018, the kind of sticky August day when the air clings to your skin and the city hums with restless energy. I had signed the lease on a tiny office in a converted warehouse on the edge of Cambridge. The space had 2 cracked windows peeling white paint and a lingering smell of old paper. There was no sign on the door, only a brass number plate half polished. But to me it was a cathedral. I carried in a second-hand desk I had found online, a battered swivel chair, and a microphone I had saved 3 paychecks to buy. I set the mic in the center of the desk like it was a crown jewel. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was building something of my own. In the beginning, it was just me and the hum of the radiator. I would spend long nights recording my voice under a blanket I had hung from a rod to dampen the echoes. My first show was called Echo Voices. I told stories about the city I loved, about the people often overlooked, the bus drivers, the immigrant shop owners, the young artists painting murals in back alleys. I spoke into the microphone as if I were speaking to one person sitting across from me. The audience at first was small, maybe 50 downloads in a week, but each one felt like a miracle. I remember refreshing the statistics late into the night, my heart leaping when the number climbed by 5. Daniel was there from the start. He would stop by after filming long days for his documentary projects, carrying takeout containers that smelled of sesame noodles or pizza grease. He would sit cross-legged on the floor while I edited, his camera bag tossed in the corner. Sometimes he would lift his lens and film me hunched over my laptop, earbuds in, muttering at the waveforms on the screen. He would smile and say, "One day, people are going to see what I see in you." His belief steadied me when my own wavered. By 2019, the show had reached 5,000 downloads. It felt like standing on a cliff and watching the horizon widen. Sophie came into the picture around then. She was 26, sharp-eyed and quick with a laugh, a producer who had been freelancing for a radio collective downtown. We met at a networking event in a dimly lit bar where the music was too loud. She had a habit of pulling her hair into a messy bun and waving her hands when she talked about audio editing. We hit it off immediately. She offered to help with one episode and ended up staying for all of them. With Sophie, the studio began to feel alive. She would show up with coffee balanced in one hand and her laptop bag slung over her shoulder, bursting with ideas. She was the one who insisted we upgrade the soundproofing by stapling thick blankets to the walls. She was also the one who talked me into applying for a small arts grant that ended up covering new equipment. When the award letter arrived in the mail, I held it in my hands like it was a passport to a new country. The growth was steady. By 2021, we had 50,000 downloads. Each number carried weight, each email from a listener felt personal. There was the teacher from Dorchester who said she played our episodes for her students. The retired nurse who wrote that she felt less lonely hearing stories of her community. The single mother who said one of our episodes gave her courage to start her own business. Their words stitched a fabric of belonging around me that my family had never provided. But success also brought doubt. There were nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan, wondering if I was deluding myself. My dad's voice lingered in my head. This is not real work. This is a hobby for children. I would picture him shaking his head across the dinner table and feel the old heat of shame. Then I would force myself to recall the messages from listeners, the faces of the people we interviewed, the steady hand of Daniel resting on mine as he reminded me that the work mattered. One evening in the fall of 2023, I was at the studio with Sophie. The rain drummed against the windows, and we were editing an episode about a local muralist who had transformed a derelict alley into a garden of color. My phone buzzed with an email notification. I clicked it half distracted, then froze. It was from Nathan Hale, the CEO of Horizon Tech. He had listened to our show. He wrote that our storytelling had cut through the noise, that it carried authenticity and depth. He wanted to meet. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. Sophie leaned over my shoulder, her eyes widening. She let out a low whistle. Horizon Tech was one of the biggest names in Boston, known for their innovation and deep pockets. We read the message twice then, 3 times before it sunk in. Nathan was proposing a collaboration, a branded podcast series to highlight the company's community projects. The contract figure at the bottom made my head spin. $600,000? That night, I walked home through the rain, my coat plastered to my skin, my mind racing. For years, I had carried the weight of my dad's disdain. In one moment, a door opened wide in front of me. The irony was sharp. The man who dismissed me as a disgrace might never know that the daughter he belittled had just been offered a deal larger than any paycheck Victoria had ever earned. Still, I kept the news to myself. I told Daniel, who lifted me off the ground in a hug so tight my ribs ached. I told Sophie, who danced around the studio in celebration. But I did not tell my family. I wanted to savor it in silence to keep it safe from their sneers. There was a night shortly after when I found myself walking along the Charles River, the water black under the city lights. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who sat silent at dinner tables, shrinking under her dad's words. I thought about my mother's laughter, about Aunt Maggie's quiet encouragement, about the countless hours in that tiny warehouse office. The path here had been long and often lonely, but it had been mine. The wind whipped against my face and I closed my eyes. For the first time in a long time, I felt proud without reservation. Echo Wave was no longer a fragile dream. It was real, it was strong, and it was mine to protect. The first ripple of trouble came quietly, like a whisper carried on a cold wind. It was early winter of 2023, just weeks after Nathan Hale had offered me the Horizon Tech deal. The city streets were lined with holiday lights, glowing against the dark afternoons. And inside the studio, Sophie and I were working longer hours than ever. We were building something we both knew could change the trajectory of Echo Wave. The energy in that little office pulsed with anticipation. But then one morning, I woke to a barrage of notifications on my phone. At first, I thought it was congratulations. The subject lines in my inbox had names I recognized from the audio community, people who rarely reached out. But when I opened the first message, my stomach dropped. The email was short-clipped and cutting. It asked if the rumors were true. Had I been inflating my podcast numbers to lure sponsors? I blinked at the words, my pulse quickening. Another message followed, this time from a smaller sponsor who said they were suspending payment until they clarified what was happening. I scrolled further and saw a headline on a blog that catered to industry. Gossip! Echo Wave exposed! My hands shook as I clicked. The article claimed we had faked download statistics, that we had used bots to inflate our audience. It was written with certainty, the kind that pretends to be backed by evidence but offers none. I felt the blood drain from my face. Sophie arrived minutes later, her hair tucked under a knit cap, a coffee in her hand. She took one look at me and set the cup down. What is it? She asked. I turned the laptop toward her. She read silently, her eyes narrowing, then she cursed under her breath. This reeks of Marissa Blake. The name hit me like a weight. Marissa owned Soundcore Studios, a rival company that had been circling the same clients for years. She was polished always in tailored suits at industry events, always smiling just enough to hide the sharpness underneath. We had spoken a handful of times, and I had always felt her eyes scanning me like I was prey. Sophie had warned me once that Marissa played dirty. I had brushed it off. Now the warning returned with brutal clarity. The next hours were chaos. Emails poured in, some supportive, many skeptical. A few listeners sent messages saying they believed in us, but the louder voices were the ones demanding answers. I sat at my desk writing comment threads that accused me of being a fraud, of deceiving my audience, of pretending to be bigger than I was. My throat tightened. All the nights under that blanket in the warehouse office, all the interviews and edits and long hours suddenly seemed invisible. Strangers were reducing me to a liar with a few keystrokes. Daniel came by that afternoon, his camera bag slung over his shoulder. He found me staring at the computer screen, my shoulders hunched. He placed his hand on the back of my neck gently and leaned down. "Do not let them get in your head," he said softly. "We know the truth. You know the truth." I wanted to believe him, but fear gnawed at me. By evening, Sophie and I gathered around the table, papers scattered, laptops open. She paced, pulling her sweater tighter, and insisted we fight fire with fire. We could call out Marissa directly, she said. We could launch our own campaign, drag her name through the mud, show everyone who was really behind this. Her voice carried anger and urgency, the kind of fight that comes when loyalty is tested. I listened, my hands wrapped around a lukewarm mug of tea, my mind swirling. I imagined myself standing on a stage pointing fingers, naming Marissa as the saboteur. I imagined the headlines, the endless back and forth of accusations. My stomach turned. "No," I said finally, my voice firm. "That is not who we are. If we fight dirty, we prove their point. We prove we are desperate." Sophie stopped pacing and stared at me. Then what, she asked. "Do we just sit back and take it?" I shook my head. "We work. We put everything into our episodes. We show our audience the truth the only way we can through our work." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fine. Then we work." The next weeks tested every ounce of strength I had. Each morning I woke with dread, checking my phone before my feet hit the floor, bracing myself for another article, another sponsor pulling out, another comment calling me a fake. Some nights I could not sleep at all. I would lie awake listening to the city hum and wonder if my dad had read the headlines. I imagined him smirking over his wine, telling Elaine and Victoria that he had been right all along, that I was nothing but a disgrace. The thought burned. But alongside the fear was a flicker of determination. We doubled down on our work. Sophie and I spent long nights in the studio editing until our eyes blurred. Daniel filmed promo clips that captured the heart of our stories. We interviewed local musicians, activists, small business owners. We poured authenticity into every second. Then one afternoon my phone rang. Nathan Hale's name flashed on the screen. My heart raced. I answered with a trembling hand, half expecting him to withdraw the deal. Instead, his voice was calm, steady, reassuring. "Rachel," he said, "I have read the chatter. I am not concerned. Your work speaks for itself. We are moving forward." Relief washed through me so quickly I almost collapsed into my chair. I thanked him, my voice breaking. When I hung up, Sophie grinned wide, her eyes shining. "That is it," she said. "That is the proof we need. If Horizon Tech trusts us, others will too." Still, the shadow of Marissa lingered. I caught wind of more anonymous accounts spreading lies, comments accusing me of bribing sponsors, whispers that I was manipulating numbers behind closed doors. It was exhausting. Every time I thought the storm might calm, another wave hit. I tried to remind myself of Maggie's words that truth has its own weight, but in the quiet hours I still felt the sting. One night, Daniel found me sitting on the floor of the studio, my back against the wall, tears streaming down my face. "I cannot take it," I whispered. "They are tearing me apart." He sat beside me, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. "Let them talk," he said. "You keep building. One day their words will be nothing but noise." I wanted to believe him. I held on to his voice the way I once held on to my mother's brooch, as a reminder that I was not alone. The work kept us alive. Our next episode, a deep dive into the story of a Boston chef rebuilding his restaurant after a fire caught fire itself. Listeners shared it, media outlets praised it, and slowly the tide began to turn. Our download numbers spiked, real numbers that no one could deny. Emails from listeners poured in again, not with suspicion, but with gratitude. Still, I knew the battle was not over. Marissa had drawn blood and she would not stop easily. I could almost feel her watching from across the city, waiting for me to stumble. The thought both terrified and fueled me. When I lay awake at night now, I no longer only heard my dad's voice. I heard Marissa's too, the quiet hum of rivalry turned into war. But I also heard my own stronger than it had been before. It told me to keep going, to let the work speak louder than the lies. It was a gray Saturday morning when I drove across the river to Brooklyn to visit Aunt Maggie. The city was half asleep, wet snow melting into slush along the sidewalks, the air carrying that damp chill that seeps into your bones. I gripped the steering wheel and kept the radio off. Silence felt safer. My thoughts had been heavy since the smear campaign erupted, and I longed for the comfort of the one person who had always seen me without judgment. Maggie lived in a modest brick apartment building above a bakery that filled the stairwell with the smell of warm bread and sugar. The scent greeted me as I climbed to the third floor, my boots squeaking against the old linoleum. She opened the door before I knocked as if she had been waiting, her paint-stained apron still tied around her waist. She pulled me into a hug that lasted long enough for the weight on my chest to loosen just a little. Inside her apartment, the walls were covered with student artwork, watercolors of flowers, abstract shapes in bright colors, charcoal sketches taped in uneven lines. The place looked nothing like the sterile perfection of the Monroe house. It was cluttered, lived in, filled with warmth. Maggie handed me a steaming mug of coffee, strong and sweet the way she always made it, and gestured for me to sit at the small kitchen table. "You look tired," she said softly, her gray eyes studying me. I told her about the rumors about Marissa, about the fear of losing everything I had built. She listened without interrupting, her hands folded around her mug. When I finished, she shook her head. "They can throw all the lies they want, but the truth has a way of surfacing. Your work is honest, Rachel. It will outlast the noise." Her faith steadied me, but she could tell there was more beneath the surface. I hesitated, staring at the chipped rim of my mug, then whispered the words that had haunted me since Christmas night. "He called me a disgrace like my mother." Maggie's face tightened. She reached across the table and took my hand. "Do not ever believe that," she said firmly. "Your mother was never a disgrace. She was strong, but Charles hated that she could not be controlled. You inherited her spirit, and that frightens him." Her words stung and soothed all at once. I thought of the brooch I still kept in my nightstand, of the laughter I remembered from childhood. I told Maggie I felt as if pieces of my mother's story were missing, hidden deliberately. She glanced away for a moment, then sighed. "There are things you should know," she said slowly, "but not everything is mine to tell." Before I could press her, there was a knock at the door. Maggie looked surprised. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened it to reveal a tall man in a dark overcoat dusted with snow. His hair was streaked with silver, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. For a moment, I did not recognize him. Then Maggie smiled faintly. "Rachel, this is David Cole." He stepped inside, removing his gloves. His presence filled the room with quiet authority. Maggie explained that David had been a close friend of my mother's and a trusted attorney who had helped her years ago. He extended his hand, and when I shook it, his grip was firm. "I have followed your work," he said. "Your mother would be proud." The mention of her name caught my breath. We sat at the table, and David spoke carefully, as though choosing each word with weight. "Your dad has kept certain documents hidden. They concern your mother's wishes." I froze my coffee, forgotten. "What kind of documents?" I asked. He did not answer directly. Instead, he said, "When the time is right, I will show you. For now, you should know that your mother thought of you, planned for you, in ways your dad never acknowledged." My heart pounded. For years, I had suspected there was more to her absence than the silence left behind. Now, hearing David's words, my suspicions hardened into certainty. I wanted to demand answers, to see the papers immediately, but his calm gaze stopped me. "Patience," he said. "Truth has its own rhythm." The rest of the afternoon passed in fragments. Maggie brought out cookies, their sweetness filling the room, but my thoughts spun. David asked gentle questions about my work, about the studio, about how I managed under the pressure. He nodded approvingly when I told him about Horizon Tech and the support of Nathan Hale. He said building something honest was the best defense against lies. When he left, promising we would speak again soon, the apartment felt smaller, charged with unspoken truths. I turned to Maggie, my voice trembling. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" She sighed, brushing a strand of gray hair from her forehead. "Because your dad would have made our lives miserable if I had. I wanted to protect you until you were ready." That night, I drove back through the city with a new weight on my shoulders, heavier than before, but steadier somehow. I knew now that my mother had left behind more than memories. She had left behind a truth my dad had tried to bury. I thought of him sitting in his polished dining room, smug and untouchable, and for the first time I felt the ground shift beneath him. I did not know exactly what David held or when he would reveal it, but I knew enough to understand that my dad's version of history was not the only one, and that knowledge burned like a secret flame in my chest. The night of the Christmas dinner replayed in my mind like a film I could not pause. Even days later, I could still hear the scrape of my chair against the marble floor, the collective gasp of the room, the silence that followed my words. But what haunted me most were the details I had tried to ignore in the moment, the flicker of expressions on the faces around me, the ripple that spread through the guests like shockwaves from an earthquake. The banquet hall had been dressed in perfection. Wreaths hung on every archway, candles lined the long tables, and silverware gleamed under the chandelier light. The hotel staff moved with rehearsed grace, their crisp uniforms unwrinkled, their faces carefully blank. Yet behind the glitter and order, there was tension so thick it pressed against my skin. I had walked in that evening bracing myself for something, but I had not known it would arrive so brutally. My dad had risen from his seat at the head of the table, his voice filling the room with the authority of a man used to being obeyed. He spoke of family, of loyalty, of legacy. He praised Victoria for her leadership in the company, his words flowing like wine into a glass already too full. Then his tone shifted colder, sharper. He spoke of betrayal, of weakness, of disgrace. And then he looked at me. I had felt my breath hitch my stomach twist. Around me, forks stilled in midair. Guests leaned forward slightly, their eyes sharpening with curiosity. Elaine's smile widened, the corners of her red-painted lips curving like the edge of a blade. Victoria sat straighter, anticipation in her eyes, as if she knew what was coming and had been waiting for it. When he said it, when he called me a disgrace like my mother, the room changed. I heard the rustle of dresses, the faint clink of a glass being set down too quickly. A man at the far end coughed uncomfortably, trying to cover his surprise. An older woman gasped softly and looked away, pretending to adjust her napkin. No one spoke in my defense. Not a single voice rose to contradict him. Their silence was a chorus louder than his accusation. Elaine leaned closer to him, lifting her wine glass, her smirk radiating triumph. Her eyes found mine across the table, cool and gleaming. She tilted her glass as if to toast my humiliation. Victoria's expression was worse. She looked proud that I was being crushed under his words, proud to be the favored one, the daughter who had not disappointed. I remember the weight of my own silence pressing against my chest. My hands trembled under the table, my nails digging into my palm. My throat felt dry, yet when I spoke, the words came clear, cutting through the tension. Stop borrowing my money to pay for her perfect life. The reaction was immediate and unforgettable. My dad's face flushed, then paled, his lips parting in shock. For a heartbeat, he looked like a man stripped of his armor. Elaine froze her glass halfway to her mouth, her smirk collapsing into disbelief. Victoria's eyes widened, her confidence cracking as confusion washed across her features. The guests shifted, whispering, now their voices low but urgent. I pushed back my chair, the sound loud and harsh. Every eye followed me as I stood, my pulse pounding in my ears. I held my head high, clutching my purse, and walked the length of the table. My heels struck the marble floor with deliberate rhythm, each step a statement. I can still remember the faces that lined my path. A man in a navy suit avoided my eyes, staring instead at his untouched dessert. A woman with pearls at her neck whispered something to the man beside her, her lips pursed. A younger waiter froze in place, a bottle of champagne clutched tightly in his hand, his eyes wide. Every single person seemed suspended between curiosity and discomfort, unwilling to speak, unwilling to intervene. At the far end of the room, I felt the weight of Aunt Maggie's gaze. She stood near the bar, her expression steady, her eyes filled with something fierce. She did not smile, but she nodded once, a gesture so small yet so powerful that it anchored me. I was not entirely alone. Behind me, my dad tried to recover. His voice rose, stumbling as he attempted to redirect attention back to the celebration. He thanked the guests, praised Victoria again, muttered something about family unity, but the tremor in his words betrayed him. The image of control he so carefully maintained had cracked, and everyone had seen it. I did not turn back. I pushed the double doors open and stepped into the lobby, the sound of holiday music spilling over me. The contrast was almost cruel. Outside that hall, the hotel gleamed with festivity, guests laughing, children running to see the Christmas tree. None of them knew what had just unfolded behind closed doors. In the lobby, I paused for a moment, breathing in the cold draft that swept in each time the main doors opened. I watched the snow fall outside, flakes catching in the light, and felt the sting of tears press against my eyes. But I refused to let them fall here, not where anyone could see. Later, when I replayed it in my mind, I realized the moment was not just about me standing up for myself. It was about exposing the truth. For years, I had written checks quietly funding the life they flaunted, and they had continued to dismiss me as nothing. Speaking that truth aloud had shifted something fundamental. The silence of the room told me more than any words could. They had not expected it, they had not prepared for it, and in that shock lay my power. That night alone in my apartment, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My mind returned to the faces at that table. The way Elaine's smirk collapsed, the way Victoria's pride faltered, the way my dad's voice broke. I thought about the guests whispering about the waiters pausing mid-step. They had all seen it. They would carry the story out into the city. No matter how my dad tried to spin it, the seed of doubt had been planted. For years, he had controlled the narrative. I was the disgrace, the daughter who had wasted her potential. Elaine was the paragon, Victoria the heir. But now people had seen another version. They had seen my dad caught off guard, exposed by his own daughter in front of his empire. That kind of image does not fade easily. I understood then that humiliation is its own form of power. My dad had tried to use it against me for years, but in that one moment I had turned it back on him. And though I knew he would fight to regain control, though I knew Elaine and Victoria would tighten their hold, I also knew the story had already begun to change. I closed my eyes, the memory of Maggie's nod steady in my mind. It was enough to remind me that I was not as alone as I had once felt. And as the city settled into sleep around me, I whispered to myself that this was only the beginning. The weeks after that night unfolded with a strange duality, like I was walking on two roads at once. On one path, there was my work, the studio, the hum of microphones, and the rhythm of editing that gave me purpose. On the other path, there was the heavy silence of my family, the shadow of what had happened at the Christmas dinner, and the words my dad had hurled at me still echoing. I carried both, and each morning when I woke, I had to decide which one would define me that day. January was brutal in Boston. The snow piled high against sidewalks, gray slush streaked the streets, and the cold air bit at my cheeks until they stung. Yet inside Echo Wave Studio there was warmth. Sophie and I buried ourselves in projects Daniel filmed with relentless focus, and the hum of creation drowned out the noise of gossip and suspicion. For a few hours each day, I could forget about Elaine's smirk and Victoria's satisfied glow. But it was impossible to stay insulated. The papers began to write about Monroe hotels, though carefully at first. Small notes about occupancy dropping, whispers of investor unease, comments about new expansions not meeting expectations. Each headline tugged at my attention even when I told myself to look away. I could not help but feel the connection. It was as though the empire my dad worshipped was beginning to unravel, thread by thread. Then one evening Maggie called me. Her voice was steady, but her words made my pulse quicken. "You should come over," she said. "David has something for you." I drove to her apartment through a snowstorm, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up, my hands gripping the wheel. Inside, the familiar warmth of her kitchen wrapped around me. She poured me coffee, the kind laced with sugar, the way she knew I liked it. And then David stepped forward with a folder in his hands. I recognized the weight of it before he even spoke. "This is your mother's will," he said quietly. The room fell silent except for the tick of the old clock on the wall. My fingers shook as I pulled the papers free. The words blurred at first, then sharpened into focus. My mother had left her assets to me. Not to my dad, not to the family empire. To me. For a long moment I could not breathe. It was proof that she had seen me, trusted me, planned for me. Proof that she had not abandoned me to his control. My chest ached as though a wound I had carried for years was finally being exposed to air. "Why did he hide this?" I whispered. David's expression hardened. "Because power was more important to him than honoring her." Maggie reached for my hand. "Your mother believed in you, Rachel. She left you this so you would know you were never a disgrace." Tears burned my eyes. I had lived under my dad's shadow, convinced that my mother's memory was one of weakness, of failure. Now I understood. The disgrace was not hers. It had never been mine. It belonged to him, to the lies he spun, to the empire built on silence. That night I carried the folder home and placed it on my desk. I stared at it for hours, tracing her name with my finger, hearing her laugh in my memory. It gave me strength, but it also gave me fury. He had stolen not just money, but the truth of who she was, who I was meant to be. The next day I woke with a clarity I had not felt in years. I knew the tide was turning. Monroe Hotels was faltering, and now I had proof that my mother's legacy was mine to claim. But even with that knowledge, the road ahead was not simple. More rumors surfaced online, Marissa's fingerprints all over them, whispers that I was manipulating my newfound attention to destroy my family. I ignored them as best I could, pouring myself into work. But the sting lingered. At night, Daniel held me close, his voice grounding me. "You are not defined by their lies," he reminded me. "You have something stronger." I thought of Maggie's steady eyes, of David's calm voice, of the will resting on my desk like a shield. He was right. I had the truth, and soon it would no longer be hidden. What I did not yet realize was that exposing the truth would not just shift the balance. It would ignite the final fire that none of us could stop. The weeks after Christmas felt like the world had shifted on its axis. I walked through the city streets, bundled in my coat, my boots crunching against frozen sidewalks, carrying the memory of that night like a torch. For once it was not shame I carried, but truth. The whispers had already spread beyond the Monroe Hotel walls. I knew it from the way colleagues looked at me with curiosity, from the subtle questions that landed in my inbox. My dad's carefully polished image had cracked, and I had been the one to strike the blow. At the same time, I could feel the walls closing in on them. Word reached me through acquaintances in Boston's business circles. Monroe Hotels was struggling. Occupancy rates had dipped. The new expansion that Victoria had bragged about so proudly was hemorrhaging. Money and creditors were circling. Investors who once toasted to my dad's name were hesitating to pick up his calls. The family's empire was beginning to crumble. I would be lying if I said I felt no satisfaction. For years, I had been their scapegoat, the disgrace, the child who never measured up. Now it was their turn to face scrutiny. But even in my private moments of vindication, there was also unease. This was not just about numbers on a balance sheet. It was about decades of control manipulation and silence unraveling all at once. One afternoon in February, I sat in the studio with Sophie editing an episode of our new Boston Rising series. The hum of the equipment filled the room, steady and grounding. My phone buzzed with a message from Maggie. "Come by tonight. It is important." My stomach tightened. I knew before I even arrived what it might be about. Her apartment smelled of fresh paint and coffee when I walked in. She was not alone. David Cole sat at the kitchen table, his suit jacket draped over the chair, his hands folded in front of him. His eyes met mine with the calm steadiness of a man who had carried secrets for too long. "Rachel," he said, "it is time you see what your mother left behind." He placed a thick envelope on the table, yellowed at the edges. My hands trembled as I reached for it. Inside was a copy of Elizabeth's will. The words blurred at first, my vision swimming, but then they came into focus. She had left the majority of her assets to me. There was no mention of Charles controlling them, no clause giving him authority. He had buried this for over 2 decades, pretending it did not exist, building his empire while denying me what was rightfully mine. The room tilted. Anger rose so fast I could hardly breathe. Maggie touched my shoulder gently, grounding me. David spoke again, his voice measured. "Your dad used his influence to suppress this. He kept it from you, knowing that as a child you could not fight him. But now you are no longer a child." I sat back, the papers spread before me, the weight of them heavier than stone. It was not just about money. It was about truth. My mother had not left me with nothing. She had thought of me, provided for me, trusted me. For years, my dad had used her name as an insult, a weapon, when all along she had been trying to protect me. The rage inside me was tempered by clarity. I finally understood why he had worked so hard to silence her memory, because remembering her meant remembering this. And this was proof that his power had cracks running through it. In the days that followed, news of Monroe Hotel's troubles grew louder. A major investor pulled out after a public argument with Victoria. Guests complained online about poor service at their newest property. Employees began to leave whispering about unpaid wages. Each headline was another stone falling from the castle walls. I stayed quiet, letting the tide rise on its own. At night, I read my mother's will over and over until the words imprinted themselves on my mind. It gave me strength, a reminder that I was not the weak link they painted me to be. I was her daughter, and she had seen me even when no one else did. One evening, Daniel and I walked along the frozen river, our breath clouding in the air. He listened as I told him everything about David, about the will, about the years of deceit. His jaw tightened, his eyes fierce. "You have the truth now," he said. "They cannot bury it anymore." Still, I knew my dad would try. His pride was too great to admit defeat. I imagined him pacing in his office, Elaine whispering in his ear, Victoria snapping at staff. They would fight tooth and nail to keep their grip, but the balance had already shifted. The collapse came faster than I expected. In March, a major Boston paper published an exposé on Monroe Hotels, detailing mismanagement, financial instability, and the family drama that had spilled into public view after the Christmas dinner. They quoted anonymous staff who spoke of Charles's temper, of Elaine's extravagant spending, of Victoria's arrogance. My dad's empire was no longer a symbol of success. It was a cautionary tale. The day the article ran, I sat at the studio surrounded by Sophie and our small team. The phones buzzed non-stop with journalists seeking comment. I declined them all. This was not my battle to fight publicly. I had spoken my truth once. The rest was simply watching the storm finish what it had begun. At night, I sat with Maggie in her apartment, the will resting on the table between us. She reached across and squeezed my hand. "Your mother's voice has finally been heard," she said. I nodded, tears burning my eyes. The downfall of Monroe Hotels was not just business failure. It was karma, slow and inevitable. My dad had built his empire on control, on silence, on burying the truth. Now the truth had clawed its way out undeniable, and I was no longer the daughter sitting silent at the table. I was the one holding the proof of who my mother had been, and who I had always been meant to be. The first day of spring sunlight streamed through the studio windows, spilling across the wooden floor where cables and microphones sprawled like veins of a living thing. I had arrived early that morning before Sophie or Daniel, craving silence to think. The weight of the last few months pressed on me. The revelations about my mother, the unraveling of Monroe Hotels, the sudden attention that came with it all. For the first time in years, I felt as if I was not running from shadows, but standing firmly in the open air. Emails still poured in, journalists asking for interviews, podcasters requesting collaborations, even old acquaintances from college who had once ignored me now trying to reconnect. I responded to almost none of them. Instead, I poured myself into our work-tightening scripts, editing late into the night, building Echo Wave into something that no rumor could dismantle. It felt like a slow healing, the studio itself becoming a home of sorts, filled with voices that mattered. Yet I knew the story with my family was not finished. The papers continued to report on Monroe Hotel's decline. One article described unpaid contractors staging protests outside the downtown property. Another detailed lawsuits piling up from creditors. My dad's name, once spoken with admiration, now appeared in headlines alongside words like collapse and scandal. Each time I saw it, my chest tightened, not with guilt, but with the strange ache of watching a man I had feared all my life lose everything he valued. Then one evening in late March, my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. The voice that came through was unsteady, older, familiar. It was my mother Elaine's. I paused. No, it was my mother's best friend years ago, a woman I barely remembered. She said Charles had been trying to reach me. He wanted to meet. I felt cold all over. For weeks, he had been silent, his pride keeping him at a distance. Now desperation must have driven him past that wall. I told her I would think about it. And after I hung up, I sat in the quiet studio, staring at the blinking cursor on my laptop. My dad wanted to meet me. Not as the powerful tycoon, not as the man who commanded rooms into silence, but as someone who had lost. I met him in a small cafe on the edge of Boston Harbor. The air smelled of salt and diesel from fishing boats. He looked older than I remembered, his suit hanging loose on his frame, his hair more gray than dark. He did not rise when I entered. He only looked up with tired eyes. "Rachel," he said, his voice low. "Thank you for coming." I sat across from him, my coat still on. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I studied him the way I once studied strangers for my podcast, looking for clues in the lines of his face, in the twitch of his hand around his coffee cup. He looked fragile, and that startled me. He began slowly talking about the hotels, about the investors who had turned their backs, about Victoria's mistakes that he had not been able to fix. He admitted Elaine's spending had drained resources, that their perfect image had been built on credit and bravado. Finally, he stopped circling and looked me directly in the eye. "I was wrong about you," he said. The words hung between us, brittle as glass. Part of me had waited years to hear them. Another part of me felt they were too late. He spoke again, softer now. "Your mother believed in you. I should have listened to her." Something in my chest shifted. The girl who once sat silent at those dinners longed to clutch at those words, to accept them as healing. But the woman I had become knew better. I told him calmly that I had seen her will, that I knew the truth. His eyes flickered with shame. I explained that I was no longer seeking his approval, that I had built something on my own. He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as if he carried stones. "I do not expect forgiveness," he said. "I only wanted you to know I regret it." We sat for a long while in that cafe, the sounds of cups clinking and gulls crying outside filling the silence between us. I left without promising anything, but I left lighter. For the first time, I felt the balance of power shift completely. He was no longer the man who defined me. I was the one defining myself. Weeks later, Echo Wave hosted its first live event, a storytelling night in a community theater. Sophie coordinated every detail Daniel filmed. Maggie sat in the front row beaming with pride. The room filled with nearly 300 people, many of them strangers who had connected with our podcasts, people whose faces glowed in the stage lights as they listened. When I stepped up to speak, my knees trembled. But then I looked out and saw them leaning forward, waiting for my voice, and I felt steady. I spoke not about my family, but about the power of stories to heal, to expose, to connect. I spoke about truth being louder than lies, about the courage it takes to keep creating, even when people tell you you are nothing. The applause that rose at the end felt like a wave lifting me higher than I had ever stood. Afterward, in the lobby, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She said she had been told her entire life that her art was worthless, that she should settle for something safe. But hearing my story had given her courage to try again. Her words sank into me like sunlight after a long winter. That was the true victory, not revenge, not headlines, but the knowledge that my survival gave others strength. By summer, Monroe Hotels had filed for bankruptcy. Elaine disappeared from public view. Victoria was photographed, leaving a courthouse, her expression grim. My dad retreated to a quiet property by the coast, far from the city lights he once craved. And I carried on building Echo Wave, expanding into new projects, filling each day with purpose that came not from their legacy, but from my own. On quiet nights, I still touched my mother's brooch, still thought of the will she left me, of the words David and Maggie had guarded for years. She had believed in me when I was too young to believe in myself. Now I honored that faith with every story I told. Looking back, I see it clearly. Revenge is not always about destruction. Sometimes it is about living fully, building something brighter in the ashes of what others tried to bury you under. Karma had handled its part. Sweet revenge was mine to savor in the life I created. So I leave you with this. Have you ever been told you were not enough, that your dreams did not matter? Have you carried someone else's judgment like a chain? Tell me in the comments how you broke free or how you hope to. Do not forget to like and subscribe so we can keep sharing stories of justice, resilience, and the quiet victories that change lives.